In topic 5.5, we're going to continue discussing agricultural practices with a focus on irrigation. So irrigation is using water from the ground typically, or from surface waters to grow crops. And actually it's what we use most of our fresh water for. 70% of human water use is used for irrigation of crops. And irrigation is extremely important. It was extremely important to the Green Revolution. It allows for the increased yield of land. It can also turn non-arable land, that just means land that is not able to grow crops, into arable land. If you can imagine the desert, which in terms of sunlight and temperature is often a good area for growing of crops, but it lacks water, lacks precipitation. If you can take water from an aquifer, from surface waters, and use it to irrigate that land, it can turn into incredibly productive land, as we can see here. And so much of the water used in irrigation comes from aquifers, comes from groundwater. We talked about aquifers in our last unit. Aquifers are layers of permeable rock or sediments in the ground that contain groundwater, and we could pump that groundwater out using a well. But those aquifers, if water is being extracted faster than it's being recharged, that can lead to the depletion of the aquifer. And one of the largest aquifers is the Ogallala aquifer. We could see it in blue here, okay, in the Midwest portions of the United States. This is a huge aquifer in the central United States. It supports a sixth of the world's grain production comes from agricultural lands that are irrigated by water from the Ogallala aquifer. And it provides the water for much of our agriculture in the Midwest of the United States. But it's being depleted, as I was just saying. More water is being extracted from the aquifer than its speed of recharge, and therefore it's being depleted. We can see when we did some mapping activities, you may have seen huge circles of green in areas of dry looking brown land. These are irrigated areas of agriculture. They're being irrigated by surface irrigation in this pattern where you have either spray agriculture, you have these arms which rotate around in a circular pattern. That's why those patterns show up. And when we use groundwater to irrigate land, it can lead to something that's called salinization. Salinization happens because when we extract water from the ground, it often contains dissolved salts, minerals, calcium, sodium, etc. And so when you use that water to irrigate, as the water evaporates from the surface of the soil, okay, those salts, those minerals are left behind. Okay? And that salt that's left behind can eventually build up in the soil and make that soil less productive. Eventually it can become toxic to plants until eventually the plants can no longer grow in those areas. It's beyond their range of tolerance. And we can see some of that soil salinization that's happened here. You can see this white area on top of the soil because as irrigation water sprayed on these crops, as the water evaporates, the salts are left over, leading to, over time, this area becoming salinized. We call this soil salinization. So we're going to discuss a few of the different types of irrigation methods that are used. And we'll talk about sort of their efficiency and what kind of crops they may be used for. So what you see in this picture is what's called furrow irrigation. Furrow irrigation is used for row crops, oftentimes corn, potatoes, things like that. And what happens is those crops are typically planted in rows, and then these furrows or trenches are dug alongside, and they're filled with water. It's relatively inexpensive, and this targets the water to where the plant actually needs, which is the roots, because plants absorb the water that they need through their roots. And so this is inexpensive, but it's not very efficient. So when the water is sitting in those furrows, about a third of it is lost to evaporation or maybe to runoff, and therefore that can lead to water being used less efficiently. It can also lead to quicker soil salinization because there is a lot of evaporation of the water from these furrows. So that's furrow irrigation. Another method of irrigation is flood irrigation. Flood irrigation is used oftentimes in water-tolerant crops. For example, rice is a type of crop that is grown in this flood irrigation. It's grown in what we call rice paddies, where it has to be submerged in water for a period of time in order for the rice to grow most efficiently. So in flood irrigation, you flood a large area, a whole field, with water. This can lead again to a fair amount of evaporation of that water. About 20% is lost, so it's more efficient than furrow irrigation. That's something sometimes people get confused about. They think that flood irrigation would be less efficient, but it's actually more efficient than furrow irrigation. And it can lead to waterlogging of soils. If the soil is flooded for too long, that impairs the growth of roots, causing them to become grow in anoxic conditions and can damage them. And so rice is a really important crop. 20% of the world depends on rice for their livelihood. And the growing of rice actually releases a large amount of methane into the atmosphere. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. But there are methods of flooding and draining these rice paddies that can actually reduce significantly the amount of carbon that's being emitted from these fields. And so updating our agricultural practices in the growth of rice can help be one way of reducing some of the greenhouse gases that agriculture is responsible for. Spray irrigation is another form of irrigation. These are basically giant sprinklers. Sometimes they're on an arm that rotates around or rotates linearly along the field. Sometimes they're fixed and spray in a circular pattern. These are energy intensive. They're more expensive than some of the other forms of irrigation we talked about, but they're pretty efficient, about 75 to 95% efficient at growing crops. And so these spray crops are often used in like pastures, areas where you have a large area of land where crops aren't necessarily growing in neat rows. Then spray irrigation is often used in those situations. And then the final type of irrigation is the most efficient, drip irrigation. Drip irrigation uses these special sort of hoses that are placed along the rows of whatever crops are being grown, and they basically drip out very small amounts of water constantly. And this drip provides the amount of water that's needed to the roots of these plants, but without releasing excess water that's just going to be lost in evaporation. Drip irrigation is 95% efficient, so very little water is actually being lost to evaporation. It also reduces weed growth because you're not providing water to the entire soil. You're only providing the water to the areas where you have these crops growing. Now, it is expensive. You need these special hoses. In large areas of land, this might not be practical. This is often used for high value crops, sometimes fruits, for example, use drip irrigation, tomatoes or peppers. Those often can be grown using this drip irrigation system.